turn on the video here for a second so people can see my shiny, happy face here. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining this, I guess, is our third Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for the Division 50 OIR 345 Division 50 Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. Again, my name is Max Woods. I think everybody probably knows everybody here now. Assistant Director for Nuclear Safety and Emergency Prep at the Oregon Department of Energy. We have, like following the last formats of the previous meetings, Jeff Burright, our technical leader, subject matter expert, there he is, hi Jeff, will be leading us through a PowerPoint presentation and materials that was shared with the group last week. And of course, as always, open for a robust discussion and questions, comments as we go along. I also want to draw people's attention to an email that Chris Clark sent out on Friday, notifying all members of the RAC that we have received a couple of comments, written comments from ORA, from OBI, and from League of Women Voters of Oregon. Those have all been posted to our website, and the links to those comment letters are were in the email that Chris sent out on Friday. I think that was on Friday. And so those comments letters, particularly the ones from ORA and OBI, will be, I think, pretty pertinent and relevant for today's discussion as we dive into our kind of our weighty meeting on the what's termed the pathway exemption process and how that functions and what its value is, and pose some particular and important questions about that process and some of the standards that are associated with that process. So if there's no questions at the beginning here, I think we'll probably just get going and just dive in. Jeff, looks like you're ready to roll. I'm going to pass over to you to handle the presentation materials, and we'll go from there. Thanks again, everybody, and let's dive in.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Please give me just a moment to get my screen set up here so you can see what I'm forward. Can everybody see?
Yes, looking good.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my video while I talk here. Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the rulemaking effort. Today, we're going to be getting to what I think is the crux of the technical and policy issue surrounding Oregon's definition of radioactive waste, which is what we are all here to sort through. Take a look at the agenda here. I'm going to start my presentation with some review of the specific statutory language that provides the basis for the rule in question, as well as a review of how we currently define the gamma radiation pathway exemption specifically, and that's going to be the main focus of today. Because part of our discussion today also concerns the dose limit that the state should be using when it defines radioactive waste subject to the statewide disposal prohibition, I also will be touching on how the concepts of radiation dose and health risk interrelate and how different standards out there compare. Then I'll be getting into the technical meat of the topic. I'm going to show some different potential options for how we might calculate different dose standards and how that then might affect both some in-state and out-of-state wastes that contain TNORM, which is the term of our art here, which means technically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material. My hope is that out of this presentation, each of you will be able to see the trade-offs inherent in any path that we might take from here. I also hope that this presentation can spur some good discussion today about what the state of Oregon should be trying to accomplish with these rules, given our statutory directives. You also should have received some early feedback, as Max mentioned. We've gotten from some of the committee members, which is highly relevant to today's topic. And those perspectives and recommendations that were passed out Friday, I think are fair game for today's conversation as well. As a programming note, this is the last of the technical presentations that we had planned to give during this rulemaking effort. We're certainly willing to dive into other topics as the committee sees fit, and please do let us know if there are other topics that you'd like us to give some special focus to. But our plan going forward is to provide for all of you within the next week a link to an online feedback form where we will ask again the various questions that we've posed during these rulemaking meetings and give each of you the opportunity to provide your thoughts, interests, and positions in writing on each of those questions for the department to consider. We would then take all this feedback, including the discussions that we've had live during these meetings, and put together a first draft of a revised rule set. And this would probably be a couple of months from now. So we'd give you time to provide your thoughts, and then we would take some time to consider those thoughts and figure out what to do with them. The plan would be to bring this draft to the next rulemaking meeting along with everyone's collected input and to have a discussion about how that input was addressed. We expect this next phase to take a couple of months, as I mentioned, but in the meantime, we may also try to put together a technical subcommittee to help out with some of the modeling that would underlie any rule changes, which I'll discuss a little bit later. Are there any questions before we dive in? Okay, not hearing any. Without further ado, let's get going. On the screen are the questions that I would like you to keep in mind today as I talk through the content in the presentation ahead. And I've tried to organize the presentation around these questions, beginning with, is our 500 millirem per year gamma dose standard that we use in our pathway exemption appropriate for the rule and the present day? If it's not, what alternatives should be considered? And then this third one relates specifically to the feedback that we've received, as well as some of our discussions that we've had previously, that considering what's in the existing statutes, can land cover be accounted in a pathway exemption determination? And should it be? Let's begin at the highest level by reviewing the statutes concerning the disposal of radioactive waste in the state. What you see on the screen here is the updated Oregon Revised Statute 469.525, and it was revised during the most recent legislative session. So it states that notwithstanding any other provision of the chapter, no radioactive waste shall be disposed of within the state. No person may arrange for disposal of radioactive waste within the state. No person may transport radioactive waste for disposal in the state, and no waste disposal facility for any radioactive waste shall be established, operated, or licensed within the state. There are some exceptions that follow, and they relate to temporary storage, etc. I've highlighted the section in red for two reasons. First, it was the original statutory language that was established in the late 1970s, so you can see how the recent legislative session added to the statute. And second, this prohibition relies on how you define a couple of key terms. What is a waste disposal facility? And what is radioactive waste? So now we go into the definitions associated with the statute in 469.300, and we see that first, a waste disposal facility is defined in the statute as a geographical site in or upon which radioactive waste is held or placed. It's pretty plain and simple language. If you place radioactive waste anywhere in Oregon, you have created a waste disposal facility for radioactive waste. And as I mentioned, there are certain exemptions in the statute for waste that is temporarily stored pending its final disposition in a deep geologic repository, such as the spent fuel at the former Trojan plant and the state's 2 research reactors that are not connected to the power grid. Our rule does not concern those, just stating it again. Next, we get to the definition of radioactive waste in that same statute, 469.300. And it says that radioactive waste includes all material which is discarded, unwanted, or has no present lawful economic use, contains mined or refined naturally occurring isotopes, accelerator-produced isotopes, and byproduct material, source material, or special nuclear. Radioactive waste does not include, and here again I've highlighted in red, really what this rulemaking is all about is how to define materials identified by the council, meaning the Energy Facility Siting Council, under whose authority we're doing this rulemaking right now, as presenting no significant danger to the public health and safety. This guiding language is material that presents no significant danger to public health or safety. However, since the definition of a waste disposal facility is any geographic site on which radioactive waste is held or placed, it has been interpreted since the beginning that the waste must be such that it does not present significant danger to public health or safety before it is disposed in a geographical site in Oregon, not after. So we are regulating and defining the waste here, not the place the waste ends up. And this statutory boundary is significant to today's discussion and to the letters that were sent to the group last week, because it relates to the question for this group whether land cover can be accounted for in the definition of radioactive waste under the current statutory structure. You've seen this diagram in a past presentation, but here it is again to illustrate how Oregon's waste definition structure is different. Because we regulate the waste before it is disposed, it's the same as saying that we must assume the waste is spread on the ground and accessible for human exposure in a residential scenario. Under this model, no credit is given for the protection that the several feet of dirt would provide, as I've shown you in previous presentations, how it does cut down the dose, both from a gamma radiation perspective and in preventing the escape of radon gas to the surface where it could accumulate in a home. And this is not an unheard of scenario, and the land spreading of norm materials has happened in the past in Oregon and does happen today. Whereas over on the left, you can see that in other states, they regulate the landfill and they say, all right, we would allow radioactive waste to be disposed in the state, provided that it is done in a safe manner. And so that allows them to not only establish what safeguards a landfill must provide and the boundaries. It must be this deep. It must have these controls on it. But then it provides for that waste to be disposed safely in the state. But I'll say that in the models that I've seen so far for the situation on the left, when other states do take this approach, they don't seem to include a case where a future person digs a well through a closed landfill someday in the future and brings some deeply buried T-norm to the surface, which could then be spread around a homestead. It's not an unreasonable future scenario from my perspective, and one that I don't think we should forget about when we talk about long-term risks. As I presented to you in our last meeting, the original deliberations surrounding the definition of radioactive waste in some of those written materials that we sent out considered whether the disposal of that waste would present a permanent commitment of land. In other words, would future unrestricted use of the site not be possible from a safety perspective? And so that's something that we keep in mind here as well. Here's another slide you've seen before. It's the numerical version of the diagram on the previous slide. It shows how we allow a pathway exemption for norm-bearing wastes if the generator can demonstrate compliance with the dose limits that are shown in red. And you've heard me say several times now that these limits, especially the 500 millirem per year limit for the gamma pathway specifically, were based on the federal public dose limits at the time the rule was established in the late 70s and early 80s. And that 500 millirem per year dose limit for the public is no longer used. The final review slide that I have for you here, and you've seen this before, it shows how we determine compliance today with the 500 millirem per year standard in practical terms. Back when the rule was promulgated, there was a mathematical model that equated the gamma dose limit with a field measured reading using a handheld meter of 18 micro R per hour. So just how much radiation is emanating from a source. And in this case, the source was a drum filled with the waste in question, and you had to be a foot away. This field test was meant to be a stand-in for the dose that a person would receive if there was a semi-infinite plane of soil containing the contents of that drum, and then if you built a house on top of it and spent 90% of your time in that house. If we change the dose limit as a result of this rulemaking, we also will need to change the underlying model and the corresponding field tests that you see here, which could have impacts not only on what waste is allowable for disposal in the state, but on how difficult and expensive it is to demonstrate out in the field that the waste you're disposing is legal for disposal. Before we get into our next set of questions here, are there any questions from the group or any thoughts that you have on what I've presented so far in the review? And I can't see if there are hands raised, so Max or Chris, if you could please just let me know.
Yeah, I don't see any hands raised right now.
Okay. Well, please do feel free to chime in if you have questions or thoughts to add. Right now, we're going to get to the first question for contemplation today, which is, does the 500 millirem per year gamma dose limit adequately protect public health and safety? And to lead into this conversation, I thought it might be appropriate to first back up and consider why we regulate radiation as a health concern in the first place. This slide comes from a training that Steve Reese at OSU gives to first responders, and that I took and found very helpful as well. And I found it to be a valuable explanation that I wanted to bring here. We know that at high doses, radiation can cause acute effects to the body, including organ failure and death. The range that we're concerned with in our regulations, however, is more within the chronic low doses of radiation. And in that case, the health effect that we're concerned about is the development of cancer over long durations of exposure. As described on the slide here, ionizing radiation may be thought of like a subatomic bullet fired at random. And the type of radiation determines the size of the bullet, how far it can shoot, and what it can penetrate. When you think of the concentration or the activity of a particular mass of waste, so when we say something like picocuries per gram, think of that activity like a cloud of little bullets emanating from the waste. Like I think of like bubbles you see popping off of a soda as it loses its fizz. And these ionizing bullets can knock parts out of other atoms and alter those atoms. And if that atom happens to be part of a person's DNA, and if that part of that person's DNA that it hits is responsible for replication, and in particular, the error checking function of that replicating DNA, then there's a chance that the cell in question could go rogue and start replicating with errors nonstop, or in other words, a tumor. In sort of a similar way, if a bullet were to hit a molecule of water in a person's body and split that molecule apart, it can create oxidizing free radicals in the body that do damage to cells that can lead to cancer. So what we are talking about here is a chance on top of a chance on top of a chance that a cell gets altered in such a way that a person develops cancer down the road. And not just a cancer, but a fatal cancer when we are developing our regulations. Ultimately, any standard we develop as a society is aimed at keeping the probability of this misfortune as low as can reasonably be achieved. And just for illustration purposes, here's a photograph of ionizing radioactivity within the lung cells of an ape. What you see here is a particle of plutonium-239, a human-made radionuclide that emits an alpha particle. Alpha particles are the heaviest of the types of radiation, and it was described to me like an atomic bowling ball crashing through the atoms around it. But it can only travel about an inch, and a piece of paper can stop it. The danger of alpha particles like this come when they get inside your body through inhalation or ingestion. Then they are unshielded and will emit radiation like you can see here until the body can expel it. Radon gas is called out as a health concern, and it's a product of naturally occurring radioactive material, precisely because it is a gas that can get into your lungs, drop out as something else, and then it has these alpha emitters in its decay chain. However, it's important to remember that cell damage does not necessarily mean that a person will develop cancer. A sunburn is a form of radiation damage, and we know that the body can heal from such damage to a point. The question then becomes how many sunburns you can get and how bad before it becomes a serious health risk. You can find various versions of this diagram that I'm showing here on the screen in many places. I pulled this one from the EPA website, but it comes from the NCRP, the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. What it shows is that we are all exposed to radiation every day. On average, an American receives around 310 to 350 millirems per year from natural sources like the rocks under our feet, the food that we eat, or rays from outer space. Americans on average also tend to undergo medical procedures like CT scans, which contribute another 300 plus millirems per year. When we talk about acceptable dose from other sources, such as involuntary environmental exposure from waste disposal, it's additive on top of the natural or voluntary radiation exposure that you see here, which is in the 350 to 620 range. Because the mechanism is that the atoms in our body are mostly empty space and radiation is being emitted in predictable ways and rates, we do tend to describe cancer risk as a probability based on the duration and the intensity of the exposure. A piece of radiation health science that factors into this is that we don't have definitive data on the probability of developing cancer from low doses of radiation. The signal at that low level of dose and probability is hard to distinguish from the noise of differing genetics and all the other health risk factors that are out there. Much of our information on radiation risk comes from longitudinal studies of the original atomic bomb survivors, as well as epidemiological data from radiation workers such as uranium miners. Those data sources represent the gray blobby areas in the upper right portion of the figure that you can see on the screen. Down where the radiation exposure is chronic at lower levels, we don't have the same type of data. So we extrapolate from those higher dose to risk correlations. And the way it's done around the world right now is via what's called the linear no threshold model, or essentially a straight line down to zero. What this means in practice is that from a regulatory perspective, there is no safe dose of radioactivity, because even at low doses, it is reasoned that there is some even minuscule probabilistic chance that one of those subatomic bullets will hit an unfortunate mark. This is an area where the scientific debate has remained vigorous for decades, with differing models for what is actually happening at the low dose rate end of the spectrum. For our purposes, though, we use the linear model. And the blue star that you can see there on the screen represents the 500 millirem per year dose limit currently in use in the rules. Whereas the lower yellow star represents 25 millirems per year, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's limit for unrestricted land use. And so we are in this area where there is uncertainty. Now that we've talked about radiation dose and risk in broad terms, I do want to take a more detailed look at the different dose limits that are currently used in the United States. This graphic that you see is also a repeat, but it's pertinent to this question of where the Oregon limit currently is and where it ought to be. So up at the top, you can see the occupational dose limit for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy. These are presumably voluntary dose limits, and they are an upper bound, but something that we don't hope to have happen every year. 500 millirem is still used as an occupational dose for pregnant women, but what used to be the public dose limit, 500 millirem a year, has been dialed down to 100 millirem per year, and that's what you see there for the member of for federal facilities or licensed operations. Going down even further, when a site is decommissioned, such as when a nuclear power plant is closed down, mothballed, cleaned up, the NRC site decommissioning standard is 25 millirem per year before that land can be released for unrestricted use, meaning you can do anything you want on that land. It is also the dose limit during operation for a nuclear power plant. Going down further, for a waste repository, the EPA has set a dose limit of 15 millirems per year. And that used to be the upper limit for the Superfund program, CERCLA, they've since dialed it down even more, just a little bit, to 12 millirems per year as the upper limit from a risk perspective. And I'll get into that in just a moment. And then there are some specific pathway-specific dose limits that go even further down the line. And these acceptable risk numbers constitute an allowable involuntary dose to a member of the public. And this is on top of the 1 in 3 chance of getting cancer in the United States and the 1 in 5 chance of that being a fatal cancer. There is a confusion in metrics in the United States between the annual dose and its corresponding risk. The dose versus risk debate is one that happens a lot, especially in the federal space. As you saw on the last page, the EPA Superfund program is based on lifetime cancer mortality risk using a linear model, whereas the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and US DOE express their standards in terms of allowable annual dose. Essentially, the approach used by the EPA and others to convert dose into risk is to simplify it down to a single conversion factor, or probability of cancer mortality per rem of dose. Put another way, this model projects that for every extra millirem, since that's the standard we're using, or the measurement we're using right now, for every extra millirem you receive in your life, it adds roughly a 1 in a million extra chance of developing a fatal cancer. And based on this rule of thumb, the list at the bottom of the slide, and you can see with the orange there, takes those various millirem per year limits that you saw on the previous slide, multiplied out for 30 years of exposure, and then the corresponding risk. Please keep in mind that this is a simplification on top of a simplification in a zone where, as I've told you before, we don't have a clear signal in the data. So these are not predictions that I would say you could take to the bank. If anything, I think it shows how difficult it has been over the years to arrive at a concept of acceptable involuntary risk when it comes to radioactivity. For our purposes in our rulemaking, the question we have to grapple with is, at what point would a waste present a significant public health risk? So that's the first thing we have to sort out. The next thing relates to it, and that's the question of, are the current methods for estimating the potential gamma exposure appropriate? As I mentioned before, we have a gamma pathway. I'm sorry?
Sorry to interrupt, Jeff.
Please.
Since you can't see hands. This is Hillary Haskins from Oregon Health Authority Radiation Protection. If you wouldn't mind going back to your linear no threshold slide, I wanted to point out a very important distinction for everyone on the call. And I'm sorry if my internet's really shaky today, so I'm sorry if I pause. So it's really important to look at what that scale is at the bottom, because that's not a regular scale, right? We go from 0.1 to 1.0 to 10. So that 500 limit makes it look like it's really high, but it's really not. And so for all of our people in the audience, I wanted to make sure that that 500 millirem is very, very, very small compared to 100 rem. So I just really wanted to point that out because I thought that could potentially cause some confusion with people. So thank you, Jeff.
Yes. That's great, Hillary. Thank you. Okay. As I mentioned before, we have a gamma pathway test here in Oregon that says that if you measure a barrel or a box from a foot away, and the reading is less than 18 microar per hour from your instrument, then that corresponds to less than 500 millirem per year dose for a person living in a house. As is described in the rule, this correlation between 18 and 500 is based on a model of a house built on the semi-infinite plane of the same stuff that would be in the barrel, and modeling what the dose would be 3 feet above a wood floor with a 2-foot crawl space underneath. The model also assumes that a person spends 90% of their time inside the house. I'll tell you that one of the first things I did when these rules got passed down to me was to go searching for the model that equated 18 microar per hour to 500 millirem per year. I could find references to the code that generated it, which is not used anymore, but has been incorporated into other modern software. But I could not find the original model itself. And I've asked around to people who were there at the time. I've gone looking in the archives. I just cannot find that equation. And so I say this because this is something that we will need to recreate as part of the rulemaking. And I wouldn't mind a little help if there were others of a technical bent who were interested. And bonus points if you have a license for MicroShield software. Anyway, so one thing I did find during my searching was an OSU study from 1992 that supported the rulemaking of that time. And it established the relationship between 18 microar per hour and the standard wood box or barrel that we use in the rule for the field portion of that rule equation. In this study, a box was filled with material measuring 100 picocuries per gram of uranium-238 in equilibrium. So that contains radium at that same concentration, one would assume, and 3.3 picocuries per gram of thorium-232. Based on the measurements from this box, and assuming a linear relationship here, if 100 picocuries per gram emits radiation at a rate of 42 microar per hour, as was found in the study, then the 18 microar per hour limit corresponds to about 42 picocuries per gram of radium-226 in your waste. And that's important, again, because 5 picocuries is our threshold, and we're just trying to figure out where is that top end. And because the relationship is linear, this gives us a basis to understand what it might look like if we were to assume that the original 500 millirem per year model is still valid, the corresponding it to the 18. And if we just simply dialed down the gamma dose limit in the rule to something less than 500. And then for reference, because I didn't have the model that they used at the time, I plugged the same concentration of radium-226, the 42 picocuries per gram, into a ResRad model, the free software put out by Argonne National Laboratory, to see what annual dose it would come up with. And the only parameter I changed was to make 90% occupancy inside the house, but all the other parameters at their default. And it resulted in 281 millirem per year just from the gamma portion of the dose. So we're pretty far off there. If you were to lower the shielding in ResRad to more closely approximate a house with a wood floor and a crawl space, that number would be closer to 325 millirem per year. So we're getting close, but it's clear that we could stand to update our technical basis here. And so I took this relationship and tried to see what it would look like if we did just do a very simple, let's dial it down approach. And what you see here in the table would be the result of that. What you can see on the top row is what's in the rule today. 500 millirem per year, corresponding to, one presumes, 42 picocuries per gram, which correlates to 18 microar per hour from a handheld meter. And so the green column represents that field measurement with the handheld meter. It's a different unit than what's in blue, just so we're all clear. If we were to try to dial that down to 100 millirem per year, then you essentially take 42 divided by 5, and that gives you 8.4 picocuries per gram as your upper limit in the waste, which is not that far above the 5 picocurie per gram threshold that wouldn't need a pathway exemption. If you were to try to dial it down to 25 millirem per year, the corresponding concentration would be 2.1 picocuries per gram, which is below the threshold. And as I mentioned, over on the right-hand side in green is the corresponding measurement from 1 foot away from a box or a barrel. When you get down to the low microar per hour limits, it becomes hard to implement in the field because of variability in the meter, variability in the waste, and the local background radiation. That can just become a tough thing to prove, as I've been given to understand from people who are actually doing this out in the field. But let's take that table that I just showed you and let's add a couple of columns off to the right, where instead of using a box or a barrel, let's see what it would be on something that's larger, something that's more appropriate to what would actually be disposed in a landfill, which would be a dumpster full of material, for example. In that case, the corresponding field measurement limit would go up for the same concentration of material. So, for example, 18 microar per hour from a drum is equivalent to if your meter was reading 40 microar per hour from a 10-yard disposal box, but the waste inside would still be the same concentration, 42 picocuries per gram. So the idea being that if you have a larger geometry that you're measuring, it does make a lower limit somewhat more implementable in the field, at least in the 100 millirem per year range. There would still probably be some trouble down in 25 millirem. And just my caveat here that these are just estimates based on some similar upsizing calculations that I've been seeing over the past couple of years, but we would need to verify and validate any final screening level. So the purpose of this is really just to give you an approximate sense for the purposes of our discussion. Let's try getting at it a whole different way. Rather than trying to just dial down linearly from our pre-existing model, let's try putting it into ResRad as an alternative way to try to get there. So to do that, I put different concentrations of radium-226 into the ResRad modeling code until I hit the annual dose rate equivalents on the left side of the table. And here you can see that the corresponding concentrations of material for the same dose rate are higher, or more permissive, if you will, than the older Odo model. For example, instead of 42 picocuries per gram, you could go as high as 75 picocuries per gram to be equivalent to that 500 millirem standard. And the 100 millirem equivalent down one row lower would be as high as 15 picocuries per gram instead of 8.4. Also, the corresponding field measurement levels would be higher and more implementable for verifying compliance on a per load basis. But you will see that the 25 millirem per year standard would still have to be below, or would still have you below the 5 picocurie per gram threshold. As a note, these ResRad results assumed 90% occupancy, but all other factors were at their default. I did 2 ResRad runs, though, adjusting the external gamma shielding factor between the default, which is the 30% shielding, and a lesser shielding factor, 18%, that you can see there, which is the closest approximation I've been able to find in the literature for a house with a wood floor and a crawl space. So just there's still some work that could be done here to dial it in. But again, for the purposes of for discussion, here's what you could expect the potential effect to be on what the actual concentration of waste that could be accepted for disposal in Oregon might be if we just said, let's just dial down what we've got. Now, I've shown you some different ways that it could look if the standard were to dial down to try to match the other federal standards. But now I want to go back to the event that led to this process we're in today, so you may see what some of the practical effects could be. Here you can see a distribution of the concentrations of the material that came into Oregon from the hydraulic fracture and T-norm wastes from North Dakota and other states by the amount of tons that were disposed during that time. The average concentration of radium-226 was approximately in the 75 to 90 picocurie per gram range, but you can see that a substantial amount of the waste was less than 50 picocuries per gram. For reference, North Dakota in 2016 passed new regulations that would permit up to 50 picocuries per gram of combined radium to be disposed in their landfills in the state. But that's only if the landfill first receives a specific license to do so from the state, and if it implements various worker safety protocols, various controls on the disposal, like how deep it has to be. And Montana and Colorado have passed similar regulations. But I'll say again that Oregon is different in that if we say that a waste is not radioactive below a particular level, then its disposal is not regulated. And it can technically go to any normal landfill without those extra administrative steps or depth requirements or what have you. This is important to keep in mind as we think about the pathway limits, but also as we consider the proposals to incorporate land cover and other factors that would reduce that dose rate when we're deciding whether a waste fits the definition of radioactive waste. For another comparison, let's also look at some wastes that have received pathway exemptions in Oregon over the years. Some of these are older, while some are more recent. Some are in-state and some are from out of state. If we focus on the radium-226 column, which is right here, if you can see my cursor, up here you can see what our threshold limit is, and then here you can see the various concentrations in picocuries per gram that have passed the pathway tests and been allowable for disposal in the state. And it's varied from a low of 8 to a high of 100 when mixed with other sands prior to becoming a waste. Just from my experience, I would say that the upper bound of our current pathway exemption model is somewhere in the vicinity of 55 to 60 picocuries per gram of radium-226. But it does depend on the specific characteristics of the waste. So this gives you a sense of how things are operating now today with our 500 millirem per year limit. The reason I'm bringing this to your attention is to not shy away from the fact that if we dial down the pathway limit for gamma, there are some wastes, including wastes currently produced in the state, that would likely no longer qualify for a pathway exemption and would need to seek more costly disposal out of state. These wastes are currently disposed in landfills, so the real world dose is expected to be much lower than the 500 millirem level, which, again, further complicates the policy decisions to be made here. Now, there's one last question that I wanted to bring before you before we get into the discussion. And this is something that I've alluded to in past meetings, but wanted to illustrate here while we're talking about the technical side of things. One of the original questions that we had coming into this rulemaking was whether our 3 tests were adequate for covering all the potential pathways of future risk to the public. One for which I could use your perspective is the plant uptake pathway. So roots bringing it up, or if it's on leaves that people eat, for example. For some norm isotopes, such as lead-210, radium can as well, the plant uptake pathway can be a major contributor of dose. But this pathway was not included in the original rule. And I don't know if that was a conscious decision at that time, or if we simply didn't have good tools to estimate the potential dose from the pathway back then. But now ResRad does include it, and it has us wondering whether we ought to as well. I will say that plant rooting depth can vary, but for your average vegetable garden, it may be expected that if the wastes are buried deep enough, this is not a viable pathway. And so that again comes to, does land cover play a part? However, if we're looking at a land spreading scenario, then this is viable. Or if you bury waste deep, but it's later exhumed from drill cuttings under an unrestricted land use scenario, and then it's spread into a garden, well, then the exposure pathway again becomes potentially viable. So there's not an easy answer here. And so similar to the gamma pathway exercise, I ran some numbers, putting some different concentrations of both radium and lead-210 into ResRad to see what the corresponding plant ingestion dose might be. And that is this column here, third one in. As you can see, it takes as little as 10 picocuries per gram of each, so putting them together, to reach a 100 millirem per year dose from the plant ingestion pathway alone. But then if you also include the gamma that's coming as well, then it gets up as high as 185 millirem per year for 10 picocuries per gram of each. And so this could be a rather significant effect on the rule if we did decide to include the plant uptake pathway. So we wanted to see what this group thought about it. We're going to get into the discussion here. I just want to say that none of these decisions are easy. We are talking about these things all the time. And part of the reason why we are having this rulemaking committee is because there are not clear answers. And there's a lot of nuance here and little in the way of clear guidance other than this. Oregon decided that this state would not be host to radioactive waste disposal facilities or radioactive waste disposal in general. And decades ago, our agency and the Energy Facility Siting Council rose to the occasion of deciding what that means. And now it's our turn to look at how things have changed since then and determine what it should mean now and potentially for the next 40 years. So thanks for the attention. I hope this has provided a good basis for the discussion, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Are we open for comment?
Jeff. Oh, yes. Was that Andy speaking there?
It is Andy.
Yeah, why don't we just dive in? I was going to ask Jeff if you could pull up the first question of your of the three, just to kind of get the conversation going. But Andy, why don't you go ahead and speak up and say what's on your mind?
Okay, Jeff, I enjoyed your presentation. I'm a certified health physicist. I consult to Andrea, and a lot of my practice through the years has been on these complicated models of future dose, based on disposal or any other form of contamination, including the uranium decay chain with radium and lead-210. So I'm infinitely aware of all these caveats that you presented so well here today. And just a couple things I want to point out to educate our discussion moving forward. The first, and by the way, I do have licenses for MicroShield, so I can do those models, but I've done a ton of models on 55-gallon drums, B25 boxes, which is the dimension of the other geometry in the old roll, the box, and on roll-off containers, and of course on landfills. And the thing that's missing in what they wrote way back when for the 500 milligram is they converted backwards from the infinite slab geometry to what would the dose rate be in a 55-gallon drum. That's how you end up with an 18 microR per hour limit that corresponds to 500 milligram. But the picocuries per gram that result in the 18 microR an hour, when you put them in an infinite slab, that dose rate goes up to about 50 to 51 microR an hour, and hence, at 90% occupancy, you get 500 milligram. So that's that disconnect between how do you get 500 milligram from 18 microR an hour. It's 18 micro an hour, 18 microR an hour when it's in the drum, but when it's in an infinite slab, which is a huge source, the same picocurie per gram give you about 3x on the dose rate. So 18 goes to over 50, and you get your 500 milligram in a year. The second item, you're absolutely correct about the 500 milligram. One of the biggest projects I managed was in the early 90s at that time, was after ICRP changed their dose recommendations. In 1977, they published 4 reports, starting with ICRP 26, then additional volumes that had the dose conversion factors that are still in use today in the United States. But it took us to 1994 to implement them. And they were implemented by the NRC and the DOE in 1994. And I had to go through, I was working at a nuclear power plant at the time, and update all our program documents and procedures to incorporate these new limits. But the big change, and it's the same change we're going to talk about today, is it wasn't just a reduction in dose. There was a great reduction. The public went from 500 to 100, and the occupational went from you could get 25 rem a year if you had the right bank back then, and it went down to 5 rem a year for occupational, and then through practice of LR it went down to 2 rem. Public went from 500 milligram to 100 milligram. But the big thing that was the challenge to implement was everything was pretty much based on dose rate then. So your 500 for the external dose rate, that was appropriate for the era that rule was written. But after 1994 in the United States and federal space, it was all pathways. So it was external shine, which we already were good at prior to 1994, plus all other pathways. So it was total effective dose equivalent. I know you're very familiar with that. So it was 100 milligram a year, total effective dose equivalent, which is essentially all pathways, internal and external, and radon in certain circumstances, and ALAR as low as reasonably achievable. And at first, everyone thought, holy cow, it's a huge reduction in both occupational and in public. But in practice, if you were going to do an appropriate evaluation of all the pathways, it made you look at the things like the difference between the dose rate on a 55-gallon drum and an infinite slab. And it became apparent to everyone that was working with these changes that you had to have, a reasonable model of all your exposure scenarios to get compliance with the 100 milligram or your occupational limits if you were going to include all the pathways in ALARA. So it became a little more challenging for the health physicists, but the benefit was, the risk was truly reflected in what you came up with. I think that the 18 micro an hour on the drum, it really doesn't reflect the risk of putting that drum in a landfill if it had norm. You'd need the perfect scenario of every drum going into landfill for years, get that infinite slab to get anywhere near the 500 milligram. So I think the key going forward to all these caveats that we have, like lead 210, like land spreading, plant consumption as a pathway, if you go to the 100 milligram public dose limit, but you also incorporate the total effective dose equivalent, all pathways, plus ALARA, you'll get away from those very limiting assumptions and get into the actual model or the actual what the waste is going to look like placed in the landfill and the real risk from that disposal. So a great presentation, really got my juices flowing as a geek HP. And I know what I'm talking about is probably overwhelming to someone that isn't a health physicist, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
I do, Andy. At least I think I do. And I appreciate the perspective there. And, I think it really does come down to this diagram here in my mind.
It does.
Yeah. Can you dispose of something in a landfill and not call it radioactive waste if that same material, when not disposed in a landfill, we would call radioactive waste? And it's the how the statute is structured. It's just hard to figure out how one could allow that, because what you're essentially saying is, let's move over to the diagram on the left and let's say, hey, as long as a normal landfill doing what it normally does can dispose of normal waste that contains some radioactivity, and if you stay below a dose limit, well, why are we concerned? The question then becomes, well, aren't you making a radioactive waste disposal facility because it needs those protections in order to not be a risk? And are there plausible scenarios in which those things that you've buried could become a risk again? Just my thoughts on it. But
yeah, that brings in the third element to that 100 milligram a year or the 25 milligram a year for decommissioning or for the release of material. It is based on a 1,000 year into the future snapshot, hence using ResRad. That does that for you. To cover just the point that you're making is, if you're putting it into a landfill, things are going to change over time, and how do you know if it's still protective? But I think the key is, if you're assuming an infinite slab, then it really is a radioactive waste disposal facility, because all that space is going to be filled with whatever the source term we're discussing is. Where the reality is, you get a drum every once in a while of norm waste, and it's commingled with whatever else the landfill routinely takes. So it really isn't a radioactive waste disposal facility per se. It's a disposal facility that occasionally has a drum of norm in it. And that's the way it needs to be modeled if it's going to be reflective of the future dose or risk.
And something to consider there is what agency would regulate that. We don't necessarily have a program in the state for regulating drums of material that would be radioactive waste if land spread going to a non-radioactive landfill.
Right. Essentially, you would have to then have a model for a landfill to show that it can accept a certain amount of this stuff before it, quote unquote, becomes a radioactive waste landfill. But if you're going through the process of modeling it to find out its upper limit and then regulating it to make sure that nothing goes in there to get above that limit, it's kind of a rose by any other name. You're regulating a landfill to keep it not a radioactive waste landfill, but you're also regulating it as a radioactive waste landfill. The logic gets boggling.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think the difference is a radioactive waste landfill has engineered, it's designed to take that, or it's designed specific to a radioactive source term. Whereas a municipal landfill is designed for municipal waste, and you shouldn't get away from that. It should still be designed for municipal waste. But that's certainly robust enough to take, the occasional drum of norm waste. That's the end point. Not changing the design so that you could take an unlimited stream of norm waste. That would be, and your design changes, and it is a radioactive waste landfill. But the flip side of that coin is you need a generic model that takes into account, the reality. If land spreading of those types of waste streams is common, you would have to include that.
Yeah.
I know the way a lot of states do it is they take the solid waste minimum design criteria for their generic model, whatever that is, but they do not take credit for is synthetic materials like liners. But if it's soil cover or the depth that's put in, as long as it's in the minimum design, it's what allowed by their solid waste regulation. They use those as inputs.
Sorry to interrupt here. I see that Colby has had his hand up for a bit. And Shirley also has her hand.
Yeah, Colby Mangini with Risk Assessment Corporation. I had a question related to this. So the slide that was just up, I don't know the requirements for the site in Arlington, but if you could educate me, what are the post-closure requirements for when that site closes? Because to me, the realism of those two pictures, what we're saying that the right side of it is what we're trying to model, but I would have to assume that the post-closure requirements for this particular site, and I know all landfills are not the same, but would be more closely aligned with what's on the left, where you do have a cap and cover on the site based off of what's being disposed there. Or actually any landfill really is, what are the requirements in Oregon for normal landfills in terms of closing them?
I don't want to speak for Jim, who would be able to speak a lot more eloquently about what the chem waste facilities closure requirements are. And I'm not sure what requirements are there for just a regular solid waste landfill, but generally under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that regulates hazardous waste landfills, like the CWM facility is, there are requirements for a particular cap to be put on the landfill to try to prevent moisture from getting into the landfill. And then a minimum of 30 years of post-closure care to make sure that that cap stays intact and to monitor the landfill as it dries out whatever moisture was in there before it was capped. Jim, is there anything that you want to add there?
Yeah, there's really nothing special about chem waste with respect to other landfills in the state. All subtitle D permitted landfills. You know, there are some exceptions for, you know, old past practice landfills, but generally 30-year closure period is assumed. It can go longer than that if it's still producing leachate or other gas or other things. So,
and it's worth noting that that closure is regulated by DEQ.
correct.
And radionuclides are not typically included in the analyte list for post-closure monitoring. So here again, if we're looking at sort of this gray area landfill that is accepting waste that would not be approvable for land spreading, that regulatory framework is not in place for post-closure monitoring.
Well, I mean, Tom, I think, you know, at this point in time, you guys are, I don't want to say, you're the regulator for you know, isotope or norm and T-norm wastes in the state, and I think that's rightfully so. You have the expertise to do it. You know, ultimately, you know, to be honest, if whatever comes of this, I think you're going to need a bigger staff, right? Because you're going to be regulating all landfills in the state.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, you're creating a program here.
And this is something we discuss in the office all the time is, you know,
right.
So if we're requiring us to regulate landfills, then how is that different than regulating a radioactive landfill? And it's a fine line.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep, agreed.
I'm going to call on, this is Max, I'm going to call on Shirley Weathers, who has a hand raised. Shirley, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I'm a member of the public in the definition that people have been talking about. I have no prior expertise in this particular technical scientific area, but I'm feeling like I'm coming fairly close to grasping the concept about the drum versus the infinite slab that Andy raised and you all are talking about, but you're moving on more quickly than maybe the rest of us are able to. Could you, Jeff, maybe, or someone go back and re-summarize as simply as you can what the point is for the purposes of this rulemaking? Thank you, if that's clear.
I'll do my best, Shirley, and let's make sure we get it sorted out here. So what Andy was talking about with the infinite slab and how 18 corresponds to something else. So in our rule, we said 500 millirems per year to a member of the public living in a house built on top of this stuff. And that's the semi-infinite plane that you just have a thin spread of peanut butter over the land and you build a house on it. And what they did at the time was to say, all right, I'm in this house. How many micro-R per hour can I have in a year before it adds up to 500? And as Andy said, that is roughly around 50 micro-R per hour of you sitting in a chair in your house throughout the year, 90% of the time in that house, that if you do all that math, that equals out to about 500 millirem a year built on top of this spread of stuff. And then they used some computer modeling to say, all right, what if we scooped up just some of that stuff that you've built your house on and put it in a barrel? So there's less of it, meaning that it's emitting less radiation than you would be getting sitting in the house, the 50. So what is the downsized amount that if you put it in a barrel, you could scan it with your hand wand and know that it is equivalent to what it would be if it was spread on the ground and a house built on it? And that math is what you see on the screen here, where the equivalent of 50-ish that would be spread out on the ground and emitting from more directions, because it's, you know, it's coming at you from all directions beneath you, versus the smaller amount in the drum. They're saying that, you know, spread out on the ground, your meter would be reading 50. If you scooped up some of it and put it in a drum, your meter would only be reading 18. But it's the same stuff that if you were to spread it out would equate to this 500 millirem per year limit.
And the way I look at it, which is just a slightly different way of looking at it, if you think of it as heat, right? So you have a big pot of soup that's 110 degrees in the middle of a field. That's your drum. If you have that same pot of soup sitting on top of a big asphalt slab that is also at 110 degrees, that's the infinite plane. And that asphalt slab is going to be heating the area a lot more than just that pot of soup.
And so to get at your question, Shirley, of what is the point of all this? It's this question of, if we were to say, well, 500 millirem, this is the human side of it. What dose is appropriate to have people be exposed to? And what we are saying is 500 was the standard of the day when this rule was first put out, but that rule has since dialed down. And that's that it's down to 100 or 25, depending on, you know, what perspective you take, or even lower depending on the perspective you take. So if we were to dial down this left side, then we also have to dial down how much stuff you could have in the soil under your house, which then correspondingly means that the signal coming off of a smaller amount in a drum would be a lot lower. And there's concern from people that this might be hard to demonstrate in using your handheld meter. And so then you have a rule that you can't actually implement because it is too small of a signal in practical purposes. What I was trying to demonstrate over here, though, is that once you get back into larger dumpsters, maybe those are still implementable. You just can't do it via a barrel anymore. You've got to do it via larger amounts. And then finally, last piece is we could continue the way we've done here, which is to say infinite spread of land, you build a house on it and you figure out what the equivalent is, and that's your standard. Or what some people are proposing is you model the landfill that you're putting all this stuff in, and you take credit for the fact that you're burying it deeper than 10 feet deep, and therefore your soil is naturally providing a shielding, and you could put a house on top of that landfill in the future and have negligible dose. And if we were to take that kind of structure of how we think about this stuff, then in theory, you could allow a lot more waste in a landfill with higher concentrations in that landfill before anyone on the surface would be able to tell, assuming that it all stays where you put it. And then the question becomes, well, have you just made a radioactive waste landfill or not? And there was a slide that I wanted to show, or well, it's not our slide, it was North Dakota. They contracted Argonne National Laboratory to do a study of a generic landfill, which is what Andy has been talking about, to say, hey, what if we just had a standard landfill and they do what they normally do, and you assume some amount of stuff in there is T-norm, like he's saying, a drum every now and again. Argonne said, all right, we will take a normal landfill and we will fill it 10% up with T-norm. How hot could that waste be before a person living on the surface would receive a 100 millirem per year dose? And they assumed that the waste was buried at least 10 feet deep, and that there was a 2-meter cover on the landfill. And what they came up with that was the limit was that a future resident could live on top of a landfill that was 10% filled with waste as high as 130 picocuries per gram. And if you go back and look at the waste that was accepted in Oregon from North Dakota, a lot of that waste would be acceptable under this rubric because it was less than 130 picocuries per gram. Interestingly, the limit in North Dakota is 50 picocuries per gram in their rule, not because of this resident part, but because of concerns about worker safety and health if they were handling this material throughout the year and disposing of it. So just to give you a sense of what this might actually look like if we went down this path that some people are talking about, that we would end up allowing more than we currently allow. Did that help? Do you have other questions or thoughts you want to?
Are you still talking to me?
Yeah.
Okay. It is helping. It's intimidating, but I'm feeling like, well, I guess I'll just say I'm a little bit cautious, jumping in the direction of something that North Dakota is looking to demonstrate in terms of safety for disposal of T-norm, because they're in such a different, their mindset and their goals and their needs are so different from ours. In other words, they have tons of this stuff and they're trying to figure out what to do with it legally. And so I would just go ahead and raise a concern about motivation, or not that I'm, accusing them of having bad motivation. I'm just saying that their mindset is quite different from, I think, what we would be looking at, or at least I would be looking at as a member of the public, focusing on safety. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Shirley, this is Hillary. I think I can hopefully address that a little bit. The reason we look at North Dakota is because they're the ones who actually are the first people who started regulating it. Again, I'm from Oregon Health Authority, so on the radiation protection side for use. And when this first came up, I went to our national partners, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they are the ones who actually told me, hey, go talk to North Dakota, because they've been regulating it for the last like 5 or 10 years. So I definitely appreciate where you're coming from and their environmental standards, but that's the reason why we're going there, because they were the first to regulate it, and so they have a basis that we can build on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hillary. We have Wayne in the queue here to speak. Wayne, go ahead.
Hi, am I coming through? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hey, so I'd like to go back just even a little bit farther upstream, because my understanding of why Oregon does not permit radioactive any kind of waste disposal, and that's a pretty broad characterization right there, was that basically Oregon did not want to have any nuclear power in the state, and so if you did have nuclear power, you're going to have to ship your waste and any associated material outside the state, and that just makes it harder, I suppose. So in having this conversation, and actually, all the marvelous, presentation that was just done here, and the conversation around it, it strikes me that we're because everything is naturally radioactive. Not everything, I mean, it's just out there all the time, right? We live on a naturally radioactive world and planet, and so on and so forth. Yeah, we're basically just sort of like rearranging, deck chairs here to try to figure out just how would you do it then? Because stuff coming into landfills can be radioactive, right? And so that's essentially where we're at this point. So here's the question. If we were to come up with something and somebody were to call it a radioactive, a landfill with radioactive material in it or radioactive waste, is there a higher ruling on this that simply says, well, you really shouldn't call it that because frankly, that's not permitted in this state? You know, I got to get over that one first to make sure that what we're doing here actually passes muster with kind of the higher, background for what the original intent was. And then second, it's very natural, as Hillary just said, to want to say, okay, well, if someone is regulating this at a degree that sort of adjusts to all the factors, including the fact that a fair amount of this stuff can exist naturally, and we may be concentrating it, and how do you deal with all that? It's really natural to go to areas that have actually looked, institutions, states, whatever, to have looked at this in broader detail. And so, for instance, that work that Argonne did is really good to know. And it's also good to know how North Dakota reacted to it too. Well, okay, that's for the closure part of it, but at the end of the day, we have to handle it too. So what do we do in that respect? Those are all very rational questions that you really want to deal with. But I don't even want to go there until I hear somebody here say that that would provide some input about if we end up loosening things up, for instance, and it gets called a radioactive waste disposal site, right off the bat, are we just countering what the original intent of the legislation was or the rules were? So anyway, hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. This is Max. You have a good point. And Jeff, could you pull up the slide again that has a definition of 469-300 and the definition of radioactive waste, if that's possible? Like, really, that's what we're getting at here, Wayne. So to answer your question pretty broadly, is radioactive waste disposal facility is not allowed in Oregon, not allowed. And that's pretty clear in the statutes. So if that were the case and the outcome of, just play out a hypothetical scenario where the outcome of this rulemaking led that to be a conclusion, it would be not allowed, right? That's simply, I think, the fundamental basis of law. So what we're really trying to do here is simply come up with the definition. There we go. That's what I was thinking, Jeff. Thank you. The sub A highlighted in red definition. And that's hard. Materials identified by the council by rules presenting no significant danger to the public health and safety. That's what we're trying to define. It's really that line. What is radioactive waste, which is not allowed to be disposed of in the state, and what is not, which is perfectly allowable to be disposed of in the state. I mean, that sounds maybe fundamental, but I'd like to encourage everybody to keep their, keep their focus on this core question right here. And so the big considerations that, I think perhaps the reason we're trying that, as Jeff mentioned at the end of his presentation, which were very wise words that I agree with, this is hard, this is difficult, and it's not so clear cut. And I think what we're grappling with is across the nation, we don't have great examples. We point to North Dakota, we point to Colorado, Montana, other states that are either in the process or have regulated, or Pennsylvania, Andy, from your examples, that have regulated T-norm disposal are almost exclusively in the context of landfills, of landfill disposals that are allowable by state law that then are permitted to be safely functioning for both the surrounding public, for the environment, and in the North Dakota example, at least, for the workers that are working on the site. And because Oregon is different, we don't have a lot of examples we can point to from other states that help us understand what constitutes radioactive waste from a risk perspective to no significant danger, right? Those are some key phrasing there in the definition, no significant danger to the public health and safety. And hence this whole process. I hope that gets to your core question, right? As you have your hand back up, maybe you wanted to follow up on my points here.
No, that's very helpful. So the charge of the committee then is, so that's the reason why we're focusing on 500 and 100 milligram, because that's the public health and safety sequence
That's it.
there.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
So as part of that conversation, then there's the natural assumption that we are less concerned than at that. Not that we're not concerned, but that it doesn't really apply to workers at the site that, in theory, could become nuclear workers, or and get regulated more aggressively, dosimetry, you name it. Which then brings us all the way back to how do you really do that? And so right now the proposals, the things that have been discussed so far very nicely and in brutal detail have been through modeling, okay, and then through the potential to physically measure it, say in the field, and this is where it gets really chancy, right? This is Jeff has said this a couple times, several times actually. When you're down in the microarc per hour range, it's it's very highly variable down at background levels. And so if that's going to be called out as something to be done, and just give people an indication of this, if you have a meter in your hand and you're just kind of in a flat area, and it's well, I'll just take it inside a room, a conventionally constructed room in Oregon, you're somewhere between 10 and 20 microarc per hour. Okay, just like that. And so that, and then you go outside and it's kind of flat, and you'll see a reading. You step up next to a hillside. Now the geometry is different, right? The geometry is full. That hillside has the same amount of radioactive material, naturally occurring radioactive material, uranium, radium, thorium, but your geometry for measurement is different. You actually have more photons coming at the meter because you're simply stepping closer to that hillside, and so it's problematic to be at that low level. Your signal to background ratio is very, very poor at that point. So just to give people some examples of why that's a head scratcher about using that particular approach. It may very well be that you have to do a model, and I think that's kind of where the state had been in the past, using the barrel in that way. So anyway.
No, I appreciate that, Wayne. And I think that the practical consideration is something we're very keen to both understand and also make sure that it's a reasonable, workable approach to implement in the field. And one of Jeff's slides towards the end of his presentation have a great chart that shows, what the practical nature of this rule is. That there are companies in Oregon that produce norm and T-norm waste, and there's, as we know, landfills that may handle the material or may not want to handle the material, transfer stations that may or may not want to handle the material. And they need to have a way to measure it. I mean, and it's just as simple as that. We need to have a way that's practical, that in the field, out in the the parking lot outside of these companies' buildings, they can look at the material with their equipment and be able to understand, is it allowable in Oregon or is it not? Or do we need to call up Odo and talk about what this means for disposal options in the state? So we're keen that it needs to be implementable, whatever decisions are made here. Jim Denson, you've been patiently waiting for a while with a hand up.
No worries, Max. Good discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think the crux of the matter is what is radioactive waste, right? What thresholds do we set? Radioactivity, above those thresholds, it's radioactive waste. And as I think I pointed out really early on in this process, probably day one, was we have to take a risk-based approach. If it's if I drive down the street in my car and run a stop sign, that's a pretty risky maneuver. But as long as I adhere to the rules and stop at the stop sign, I'm my risk is much less. But the trick is, I guess the hard part for Oregon is, do you have two different methods, approaches to what's radioactive. And for my part, as folks have said, there are industry today in Oregon and other places are generating, norm and T-norm wastes in a significant amount, right? And if we were to just, lower the level, that's going to cause Oregon business their costs are going to, go up exponentially for their disposal. So I guess, my vote, if I have one, and I think I do, is, to look at this as a risk-based issue. And I think, the building a house on land applied material is a valid mechanism for looking at stuff that can just be spread on the ground and grown crops on it, or you can live on it. But the reality is, whether we like it or not, the minute you put it in, you take that waste, which most waste goes into a landfill, whether it's a sub-C landfill or a sub-D landfill, the protections are there for the public and even for, the workers. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, no, Jim, your point is well taken. The definition that Jeff flashed on the screen with the red text 469-300 definition of rad waste, and that charge to the Energy Facility Siting Council, and by extension us here, is to come up with that definition, or validate what's either in rule now or revise, hence our discussions. What is the significant risk to public health and safety? I mean, those are the phrase that I might not have those words exactly right, but that's the phrasing in the statute right now. And so, yeah, there we go. Significant danger. I said risk. Significant danger to the public health and safety. And so you could probably parse out any one of those words. I'm not a lawyer by trade, but there are plenty of lawyers who may be interested in this, these wordings here. Those 10 words really is trying to get down to the core question that we're trying to grapple with. And we deal with this not only in our everyday work, but really that's one of the core charges of this rulemaking advisory committee, is looking at those words and coming up with a workable system that is reasonable and passes that basic test, significant danger to the public health and safety, while also being cognizant of there isn't a perhaps clear-cut definition of what or agreed upon risk or dose limit, as we've just discussed for the last hour and a half, that poses that significant danger to the public health and safety. It's just not so easy.
Just real quick, I want to, just say that, maybe the gamma exposure measurement is a threshold, right, that gets you into a deeper analysis of what the waste is if it shows up at your landfill, right? Instead of it being a one of the 3 thresholds that you have to cross for a pathway, maybe we, bifurcate that and say, to do this easily, we bring waste in, and if it's over a certain threshold, based on the container that it's in and all the stuff that we use microshield for, then that warrants further investigation versus, it's over for gamma. It throws you out of the pot, I guess, for lack of a better term. I don't know. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Yeah, Jim, so what do you say that again? So how would you use the gamma as a screening threshold and then have additional assessment? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, so it's much like, we've kind of, I guess, morphed into of late. We have a waste stream that comes in. We have our initial background with the portal, right, that says, it's over 2 times background. We got to look into it a little more. So we bring it in, we wand it with the wand and get the gamma exposure. And also we look at what isotope it is with some amount of certainty. And if we know waste that has 5 picocuries per gram of radium in it, you know, is in that size of a box, is going to show, you know, 25 microR per hour. As long as it's under 25 microR per hour, we're good to go. If it's over 25 microR per hour, then we got to sample the waste and do isotopic analysis on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you'd have a sort of a gamma test for sort of, maybe if I'm thinking about this, Jim, something that's in between the pathway, a step that's prior to the pathway exemption process, so to speak. Yeah, okay. A clear definition rule, clear correlation between the microR per hour and threshold for allowable material.
Right.
Yeah.
And
that's sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's tough because, you know, it depends on the container and the size of the container, what you're going to measure. But I mean, that would make it much simpler, you know, in the case of, you know, a company throwing away, you know, 25 grinding discs that have zirconium in them and 25 sanding belts, you know, the gamma exposure from those in a bin are going to be low, very low, right? Almost immeasurable. So it's a screening tool that gets you to whether or not it's radioactive or not, proving it. So
yeah, I appreciate the practical nature of that approach. My first thought in my mind, it does mean that both companies in Oregon that handle norm, T-norm, perhaps that are licensed by RPS, they already would have to have these procedures in place to understand you know, what exactly is their lawful allowable disposal options for their waste. But it also might mean that, you know, these are statewide rules that all landfills in the state that are, you know, in compliance with this regulation have to have some procedure or mechanical structure, whether it's portable alarm or something else, to, you know, just to be able to verify compliance. And maybe that's, you know, reasonable direction, but just kind of putting that out there, certainly beyond chem waste. There are some landfills in the state that have, and transfer stations that have portal alarms, but not all of them. We don't have a clear, one of the things that's on our charge is to try and figure out which landfills do have portal alarms and map that out accordingly. Anyway, that was just sort of a thought that comes to mind. Jamie from DEQ, perhaps you can shed some light on this. Thank you for raising your hand.
Yeah, I'm, you know, as I'm listening, I'm wondering if there is a need for DEQ to fill some sort of gap between, you know, what's safe to be applied to the ground, you know, like soils and other things that, you know, inert sorts of materials versus, you know, the sorts of things, other sorts of things like T-norm that wouldn't, you know, just be thrown on the ground. Regardless, they would be considered as solid waste and need to be disposed of in a regulated facility, right? So some of the things going to, you know, to chem waste are like the socks, right? You're not, like, that's where my brain is right now. It's like, okay, we've got dirts that could be kind of like the public, and there could be more significant danger, like this term significant danger, where, you know, you've got materials that are clearly identified as weird and dangerous potentially, and your kids are not going to go play with these like socks, or like you're not going to plant food in these like other sort of mining sorts of things. But then you've got like dirt or other things that look like could be just normally in your backyard, right? And so I'm trying to wrap my head around all of this, but I do see, depending on the approach taken, additional like policy that could be developed to ensure, like calling the sorts of material like a special waste, where a facility would need to submit a plan to the department, you know, explaining like how they would manage it safely. This would be a different approach than we currently take because we don't regulate, you know, like this radioactive waste. It's like a new concept for the state, right? where there's something that's not radioactive waste, but still presents some sort of risk, but is not currently, we don't have policy to address it. But yeah, I'm really, right now, I'm focusing on these words of significant danger. Various things in the world present more danger depending on like how they are handled or where they are placed or the measures put in place to reduce the amount of danger, right? And I think there might be an opening there to create the framework that other states, taking both our framework and kind of melding it. That's where my brain is right now, I guess is where I'm going. But this conversation has been great.
Thanks, James. So you're thinking more on the, if I hear you, perhaps offering, if I'm hearing it, to work with DEQ on the land spreading concept in particular, because I think that's what we're trying to, the rules right now. Rules right now make no distinction between waste that is disposed of just in the backyard, and we've given out examples of disposing of material on the land versus land at a landfill. And there's even amongst landfills, there's certain classifications of handling and processing of, right? So there's quite a range of how this waste. So if we were able to, as a state, come up with a method, now that would be easier to apply towards the in-state generators of this material, of course, than perhaps out of state. But just as a concept, there might be something there to consider around the disposal of this waste and how it might be distinction of where it goes.
Just because it's not a radioactive waste doesn't mean it isn't a solid waste that requires some sort of regulated disposal, right? We have various off-ramps and exemptions, right, under our solid waste rules. But yeah, I need to look at a few things and do a bit more research. But if we try to approach, from what I'm hearing, yeah, it's sounding more and more like DEQ would need to work directly with, we would have to collaborate to ensure that you've got stuff that isn't a risk at all, right? Like the really low stuff that 25 under or whatever, anyone can use it, don't worry about it stuff. And then you've got this other area of stuff that if it's managed in a certain way, it doesn't present a significant danger. And that's what I'm hearing right now is we're trying to figure out what to do with the stuff that's, in between, and how to regulate it in a way where we ensure, that no significant danger does happen. Yeah,
thanks, Jamie. I appreciate your focusing on the statutory definition as well, because that's where I tend to fall back on. And the other part of that definition that's worth considering is the very first word, which is materials. And so the materials, to me, meaning the waste stream itself, right? And so that's when you have to, the legal question becomes, is there an allowance, and this is a legitimate question, is there an allowance for how the materials are packaged and disposed of in that consideration?
Right. So I'm thinking of some simple concept that isn't like knives, right? If you have your knives properly in your butcher block and you wrap them with tape and the knives can't get out, they present far less danger to people than just knives on your counter, right? So even though it's like a material, it's all about how it's managed, right? That's where my brain is right now. But that I'm not a lawyer, so.
Yeah. Appreciate the thoughts, Jamie. Is there any other questions right now? If not, I think we're due for a quick break. I think we should do that right now. We'll take a quick break. Why don't we come back at 10:50? That's worth it. We'll just take a quick 8-minute break, get a coffee refill, and then continue the discussion. Any objections to that? Hearing none. Okay, we'll take a quick break to 10:50 and then get back on and continue. Thanks, everyone. Okay, everybody, it's 10:50. I'm gonna get us started back into this conversation. If there's no specific hands up or questions that people want to bring about, we, in our debate, in our dialogue here, we haven't gotten into the third question that Jeff posed in his presentation around the other potential exposure pathways that hasn't really been discussed. The presentation materials that Jeff displayed has a slide. There we go. That's the slide I was thinking. Consideration about additional pathways that the pathway exemption process could consider. As noted on the slide here, there are 3 currently under consideration: gamma, water, and radon. A 4th pathway is a question to the group. Should this be a 4th? This is a question to the group. The plant uptake. And so I think that's a worthwhile discussion here. I'd be curious to hear if any other parties on the RAC have opinions about that, and what the thoughts are of the group. And I'll open it up for any points to make. Anybody have any thoughts on this they want to discuss? Jim, dive in.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I mean, I think the plant pathway is a valid one, especially for land spreading. I don't think it it doesn't come into play for landfills. So, you know, I will just say though, lead-210 is very hard to measure accurately, and it really needs to be a science-based approach for the threshold at which lead-210 becomes an issue with plant-based uptake. So, just some thoughts.
And lead-210 is also an issue in that if it's present out of equilibrium, then it doesn't have a gamma signature. So if you're using gamma as your only screen for whether something needs to be evaluated, something that's enriched in lead-210 won't show up.
You're right. You're exactly right.
And can you, Tom, just for the benefit of the group, or Jeff perhaps, explain why lead-210, why the plant ingestion matters with lead-210 in particular? I think that might be something that a lot of the folks may not quite understand exactly how lead-210, how it is taken up by plants and how it is otherwise, like you mentioned, Jim, difficult to detect from other screening methods.
Yeah, I can't recall the exact mechanism. What I do recall is
Jeff,
go ahead.
I could take that one. Andy here. I've got a lot of experience with lead-10. It's a very unique progeny of radium-226, which decays to radon gas, and then radon gas has 5 progeny, and 3 of them are very short-lived. So as soon as the radon gas dissipates, they're gone. But they leave behind lead-210 and polonium-210. One's a couple year half-life and one's 130 days. So you have this almost gas-borne scale of lead and polonium. And both lead and polonium are, if they're in your soil, there is plant uptake. They're incorporated into the roots of plants. You know, tobacco, most of the lung cancers caused by tobacco are from the radon progeny incorporated into the roots. But the lead-210 is a beta emitter, and it emits a gamma ray, but the gamma ray is a low yield and low energy gamma ray, which makes it difficult to detect. It's impossible to detect with a portal monitor, and you could take a sample and have it analyzed by gamma spec, but the lab really needs to know what they're looking for to open up the window and count it for a long time. It's just it's a challenge to detect by monitoring or by sample and analysis. It's a very unique waste stream too. Really, you need radium. If you have radium as a feed, you're going to have all the radium progeny, including lead-210. But without radium, it's a unique waste stream that's very, I've seen it in midstream gas plants that have a lot of radon mixed with natural gas, and the radon decays away, but you get these particulates like lead-210 built up on the elbow of pipes. It is a very, very unique waste stream. It's, yeah. In pipes, I don't know how much of that's going to make it into soil that could be incorporated into plants. But as a soil contaminant, you're definitely going to have plant uptake. So, you know, all the pathways are driven by the inputs, by how they're appearing in the landfill or how they're appearing wherever they are. You know, you can have a lot of any one radionuclide, but if it's not in the right configuration, it's not going to deliver much dose. So that's plant uptake is definitely a viable pathway, but you've got to get that material into soil so that it can get into roots. Also, just for a little perspective, I missed her name, but she raised some really good concerns on you don't want to have landfills that are designed for T-norm waste like they have in Colorado or North Dakota. And I agree, those are very specific landfills. There's a lot that go with that, and that's completely out of the realm of this discussion. We're only talking about, can a Class C or Class D landfill take the occasional and not radioactive, because you're excluding 90% of the world's radioactivity. You know what I mean? There's no reactor or accelerator made isotopes. And in other material is exempted. We're only talking about the occasional norm or T-norm waste stream that gets disposed of along with whatever else is going into the landfill. It's very different than those landfills in Colorado or North Dakota. Just for perspective on that, in Pennsylvania, there's 54 solid waste landfills. And during the T-norm study, they sampled leachate for a year, once a quarter, at all the landfills. And they had maybe half the landfills were taking some type of oil and gas T-norm waste on occasion, was still very small, maybe 1% of their total volume. The other half landfills took no T-norm waste. And the leachate samples were all analyzed for radium. Well, lo and behold, all the landfills leachate were positive for radium. And the average of the landfills not taking any norm waste was higher than the average for the landfills taking T-norm waste. And I know you're going to ask, well, how could that be? And it's so because uranium and radium occur naturally. So they're in all kind of waste that, you know, we're not monitoring or counting that's going into solid waste landfills. So there's a good chance you could sample leachate right now and be positive for radium without ever taking any specific norm or T-norm waste streams. We're talking about really low levels of radium in the leachate at really low levels of norm or T-norm that would be disposed of in these landfills. We're not talking about the same thing as Colorado or North Dakota, where they're actually taking the waste, the socks and the sludges, and that's all they're taking. This is very, very different than that. This is more or less happening at most landfills across the country every day. It's just that Oregon's having great foresight in addressing this now in the regulation. I'm going to shut up. That's good.
Thanks, Andy. Now, can I have a follow-up question? A couple follow-up questions. Just on your knowledge of Pennsylvania, we understand that every landfill and every municipal solid waste landfill of your 50 so odd that you mentioned has a radiation portal alarm detector. Is that the case?
Yeah, that is the case, and that's a good question, and that gives us a little more perspective too. So oh gosh, 20 years ago, maybe longer, they promulgated a rule in solid waste that every landfill had to formally monitor. Most of the landfills were already monitoring. They were getting alarms, and there was no rules about what to do, what to reject, or what to do with a truck that had a, you know, for lack of a better term, had a hot load of waste. So they formalized their regulation, and it was good. They put a little bit of specifics about the bare minimum for a portal monitor and how to maintain it. And they had a high alarm, which if you were over that alarm, you needed to take steps to ensure that it wasn't an exposure problem for the driver. And obviously that waste was rejected and isolated. And they had a low alarm, which was, I want to say 10 micro an hour above background. And background in Pennsylvania runs from 5 to 10 micro an hour. So it was about twice background was your low alarm. And if you alarmed that, if you could verify that it was medical waste was exempted because of the short half-lives, it was allowed to go in. If it was any man-made radionuclide at all, cesium or cobalt or anything that was from an accelerator reactor, it was automatically rejected no matter what the level. But the problematic third alarm was if it was norm or T-norm, you know, what do you do with that? And from that grew this whole modeling, doing generic landfill modeling, because this was way before fracking. So you didn't have that oil and gas element, but they were still getting alarms on norm and T-norm. I'm not going to say all the time, but, you know, a normal landfill would get 2 or 3 a month anyway, maybe more. And they had to figure out what to do with those. And from that experience of implementing their solid waste monitoring rule, they realized that they had a norm and T-norm issue that they had to address from a risk standpoint. The rest of it grew from there.
Yeah, thanks. I have one more follow, and Emily, I know you have your hand patiently waiting. I want to have one more follow-up for Andy. You know, in your, just as the hypothetical scenario you pose that, you know, call it the 1 barrel or 2 barrels of norm and T-norm waste that might be disposed of in an Oregon landfill. The hard part for us to reconcile is how, one, what your limit would be as to what constitutes, you know, an allowable, you know, acceptance rate of that type of material, and 2, how do we monitor it? And so those are the challenges, right? Where Oregon does not have a portal at every single one of our landfills right now, and even that doesn't solve the question about how much to allow, right?
Right. That's really the crux, isn't it? You just boiled it down to the 2 challenges here. You know, the one, it wouldn't take long. We could gin up a generic model and you could quickly come to grips, and you're going to find out too that, you know, you'd have a drum that has 10 or 20 or 30 picocuries per gram, but it's 1 drum a month or a drum a year, and it's so dilute from a risk standpoint that your concentration in the landfill's probably not affected at all by that. But the challenge is monitoring. How do you know what's going into your landfill? That's tough. That is really tough. And lead-210 is a specific example of how tough that can be. But in any norm or T-norm waste stream, you know, they're going to cause alarms. You know, it's just like if you take the meter home with you, I can point you to 3 places where you're going to get material that will alarm at the landfill. The coils in your hot water tank are going to alarm. They're concentrating radium that's in your municipal water or in your groundwater. The heating coils just cause the plating out that the radium, when your hot water tank bursts, it bursts because the radium scales built up inside your heating coils. And the water can't pass anymore. And those coils especially will be really hot. They'll be, you know, 50 to 100 micro an hour. You know, your Fiesta, where your fancy colored pottery is going to alarm from uranium, and your granite countertops are going to alarm from uranium and thorium. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that are going to alarm if you're monitoring. As someone earlier in the call said, you know, we're in a radioactive world. Almost everything has some norm. That's a true statement. It's everywhere. So like I said, you're way ahead of the curve because you are trying to address it up front rather than from behind. But that's a big challenge.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Andy. Emily,
Sure.
you have a hand up and patiently waiting. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the discussion so far. And I honestly just wanted to say one thing about the plant uptake pathway conversation. To me, and the other pathways also that are on that slide, but to me, the real question or the real thing that drives home to me is that there's a big difference between land spreading applications and landfill applications. In a landfill, plant uptake is a ridiculous pathway. You're not going to grow plants on a landfill and eat them. But in a land spreading situation, you might have a house, you might have a vegetable garden, you might have someone that's walking over that material. So that's a totally, it's a much more reasonable scenario there. If we, I think all of this to me has to always be brought back to what is the reality of what people are going to experience now and in the future. So that's just something to consider.
Jeff here. Emily, while I agree with you mostly, the one place where I would disagree regards a future well driller scenario. So let's imagine a future where you have a hill that everyone has forgotten was once a landfill. And someone puts a house on that hill and they drill a well through the soil. They bring that soil, it'd be like a 1 foot diameter column of the soil that they would bring up as they drill. And that dirt has to go somewhere. So they spread it in their garden. And if that dirt contained some of this T-norm that was disposed decades prior, is that a scenario that would then result in an unacceptable public health risk? Now, one thing we learned from our last meeting was that lead-210 has a relatively short half-life compared to others. But if you have high radium, you will be continually producing more lead-210. So it's not like it goes away if you have a lot down there. And I do think that is an area where the models like the Argonne model, I didn't see where it looked all that in depth into that future scenario.
So I think there's two things that come to mind there, Jeff, because I agree that's something to consider. The first is this is where you define your definition of radioactive waste becomes important and what is not radioactive waste, right? So that what is going in a landfill, someone is looking at that and saying, okay, landfill X can accept up to this quantity of material, or it passes these bars to make sure that we are being protective of that in the future. But the second thing is just, again, the reality is, there's a chemical and hazardous waste landfill, right? Like people could forget that exists and dig into it and pull out the chemicals, but we still allow it. So I guess I always have a problem when radioactivity is treated so differently, because to me, it's just a matter of ensuring that when it goes in and you look at these scenarios, that you're being conservative on that front end. And to me, that's something we can do by how we define these rules and these limits and what model we set up to analyze the risk from these wastes. And to me, that's just work we need to do on this front end to make sure that back end is safe, because I don't disagree that that's a possibility.
So you might find yourself. Go ahead, Max. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to move on the conversation. Jeff, go ahead, though, if you have a response, please.
Well, there's some of what we're talking about here is we say Oregon may not establish a radioactive waste landfill. I mean, that's in the statute. And it almost sounds like what's being talked about here is here's how to license a not radioactive waste landfill. And so you would need to have all the same modeling, all the same regulatory structure and enforcement and checking at the gate, all to create a quote unquote not radioactive waste landfill. And it, maybe that's the right way to go, but there's a little strangeness to it, if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah, and the definition of radioactive waste disposal says, if you put anything that the rule says is radioactive waste into a place, then it becomes a radioactive waste disposal unit. So having a rule that defines radioactive waste as something that is not disposed in a landfill, or it's not radioactive waste if it's disposed in a landfill, but the landfill can't take it unless it's not radioactive waste. It just, I go cross-eyed thinking about how that gets written coherently.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to drag out the discussion, but I would argue we kind of do this weird juggling act now in how we do these pathway exemptions. Like you have these 3 metrics by which we define something as being not radioactive. And while I think those need some revision, I still think that's the similar idea of what we're talking about now. We're just taking it one step farther. And that's how in my head, that's how it works. But I appreciate there's a difference of opinion there.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think one thing that's just we all on our side, the conservative regulatory agency here, in many ways, is when that material passes a pathway, it can be disposed of anywhere. It doesn't have to be disposed of at the by our rule. Now, DEQ and other agencies, there may be other restrictions and limitations, but it doesn't mean that it has to go to that particular landfill. I know you know that, but I just want everybody to keep that in mind. That's what a pathway exemption does from our perspective.
That's a good point, Max. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to go to Hillary, who has her hand raised, and then Wayne, and then Jamie.
Yeah, hi everyone. So 2 things now. So I definitely am inclined to agree with Emily, because I think it's really important to remember that just because something is possible doesn't mean it's likely. So I really would push people to, or the committee to look at, well, has something like this ever happened? Has anybody ever forgotten that a landfill existed and decided to build property on it? Especially one like Arlington, right? That already has all that, is already regulated to be a hazardous waste facility. So like that, as a regulator, that is how we base our risk assessment. What is the likelihood of it happening? And then what is that risk to people if that likelihood happened, right? So it's really important to make that balance, especially with radioactive materials, right? Because there's this inherent fear in the public of handling and processing radioactive materials when comparing it to other hazardous waste. Depending on what it is, it's actually a lot less of a risk than, say, if I'm handling lead and I accidentally ingest it, or if I'm working with like hazardous gases and things like that. So it's really important to mix that risk element in with probabilities and likelihoods, right? So it's really important to have that balance. So I just want to put that out there. And we also have, from a use standpoint, we have what's known as exempt quantities. So we already have thresholds and baselines for what we consider radioactive materials for use. And then, you can use those as your baseline. So is this a radioactive material? Is this not a radioactive material? So that already exists, that is out there, and that is something that we could potentially use. And you can even say, well, here is this this list, and it spells everything out by nuclide and activity. And then you can just go off of that and say, well, do we want to consider this waste or not? And you can even put another threshold on it, be like, okay, well, let's say we can have 1,000 or let's say 100 millicuries of radionuclide A, and then it's like, and that's our exemption uses for licensing. So then for waste, you could even say, okay, well, let's make that a 10% of that and say 10 millicuries can go into the waste stream. And so that is a way that you can balance it without having to reinvent the wheel, right? So you can use what's already in guidance, what's already in regulation, and base it off of that. And I think that would make things potentially less confusing. Maybe it makes it more confusing. I'm not sure. So that's that bit. So sorry, I'm jumping over for a little bit, and then back to like what Adam said. I'm really glad he brought up the scale. So a lot of facilities that have nothing to do with radioactive materials, when they're disposing of water boilers and pipes and things like that, they tend to set off these portal alarms. And that's what most of my calls are when I go out to these facilities. It's for pipe scale, which is naturally occurring. It just happens. And it's not in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a risk, but because it's happening and it's happening just with a regular waste, like a regular industrial facility. They are not using any radioactive materials whatsoever, but the scale builds up in their boilers and their pipes and things like that. And now we have all of this, what's now considered radioactive waste, even though it's really not, because it has this build up of norm in the scales. So I think it's really important to make sure we include that in our conversations as well. So thank you, Adam, for bringing that up as well. So that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. Much appreciated. Wayne, you've got a hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was very helpful, actually. Is that, I was just nosing around trying to find that list, and it would be nice, maybe if we could flash it up somewhere, it'd be great. But so a couple practical questions here, because there is some reliance on a disposer kind of knowing what is in their stuff when it rolls up to a landfill, and that can be pretty problematic, as Hillary just sort of led on there. So first question: do all Oregon landfills actually have radiation detection detectors at the gate? It sounded to me not quite all of them did, but I could have misheard that. If that's the case, then you know why Hillary gets those calls, and it could be just about anything. But scale is, scale deposition is certainly a big one for sure. But it could have been steel contaminated with radioactive cobalt, from some place that nobody knew that they were using. Well, anyway, there's stories behind that. And then second, and then if that's the case, then it really becomes a matter of saying, okay, well, whatever shows up at the door, what's our levels of concern at that point? And I just loved Jeff's, we're actually trying to dance around kind of this idea that, well, if it shows up and we think it's radioactive, but we let it go in there because it meets some criteria. In point of fact, it's still not a radioactive waste disposal site. And that's just, that really is kind of head turning, and and there's some understandable, as much as we've talked about it here in great length, it's still, it lurks in the background of, kind of what's rational here. But be that as it may, there are ways we could sort of stepwise address kind of what's about ready to be disposed when it rolls up to the landfill. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. I think the answer to your first question is no, not every landfill in the state has a radiation detection alarm or portal monitor or hand wanding, as we understand it. There are, just to consider the way waste gets transferred around the state, it may be the case where not every landfill needs a radiation portal alarm because the waste is to a transfer station that has a radiation portal alarm. Just for example, I don't think our colleagues from Oregon Metro or Portland Metro are on the call right now, but Portland Metro has 3 major transfer stations, and I believe those 3 all have radiation portal alarms. So trash leaving those facilities for disposal would have passed through, or coming in would have passed through a portal alarm. Anyway, it's a big question we're still grappling with, to your point, Wayne. Jamie, DEQ, has a hand up in queue, and then Jim. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really support like what Emily and Hillary were both saying, like a common sense approach. And I think that's why we keep talking about landfills versus land application. But yeah, very few landfills in the state. I think about 6 months ago we asked all the landfills, to confirm if they did or didn't. And I think there were only a few that I think Jim's facility was planning to install one, and maybe another was planning to install one, but those were like 2 plus maybe 1 other landfill wise. And a lot of, my understanding is like out east, a lot of it came up, why different states required monitors was because of an incident that occurred at a specific facility in those states, and that started the whole process. So kind of like, what's happening, the discussion now here. And so, yeah, that just to answer your question, Wayne, that no, I think there's like 2 in the state right now. So yeah, that's all I had.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate that. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I think everybody is right on here. The question though is, if we're gonna require portal monitors, we need to have clear rules or procedures or whatever to what do we do when the alarm goes off, because they will go off on a regular basis. So just food for thought, if that's a consideration that we're going to do, we need to know what we're going to do when the alarm goes off. Second one is, Jeff, did you do the analysis in ResRad for lead 210 and plant uptake? Do we know what the concentration is? It gives us.
Yes, it is this slide right here, Jim.
Right, there you go. So at 10, it's 100. So
yeah, and okay. Jim, just for your reference, I put 10 of each when I did that run, and it was not quite half and half, but close to.
Okay.
And one thing I need to double check is whether when I put in the radium, whether it was then, is there a plant uptake factor specifically from the radium, or is that double counting somehow? And I don't think it is, but I need to double check that.
Okay.
And again, once you add back in the gamma on top of it, if we're going to do an all pathways cumulative dose, really what you're talking about is you're back down at 5 in order to keep your total gamma plus take below 100.
Right. Cool. Thanks, man. Appreciate that.
Jamie, go ahead. Jamie, you have a response, I think.
Yeah, just quickly, in my personal experience, what Jim was saying, when I was young, in private industry, we had monitors at some of my facilities, and they would go off, and it was very frustrating. And there was very little guidance from that state's DEQ on like policy and procedures. And so they were different, like at each site. But yeah, if we do, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because more often than not, it's the driver of the truck that is setting off the alarm, just to keep that in mind. And because they're doing some sort of radioactive like thyroid treatment, or at least that was what was occurring at my facilities. But yeah, it's not a perfect solution, just having like a radiation detector at the landfill. And so I just wanted to throw that out there so that, everyone was aware that, yeah, it's a valid point, and it's not a perfect solution.
Thanks, Jamie. Good points as well. Colby, then Hillary.
Thank you. So my comment is related to the plant uptake, but then also this slide here, and it's kind of a global statement. And generally, when you have a broad target, you can have a broad model. As soon as you start narrowing your target, you really need to start narrowing your model and making it as realistic as possible. And so one example on this screen, I'm glad this is up here, is if you're talking about the 10 picocuries per gram, you can easily see the gamma dose, and that's going to be slightly dependent upon the material composition of the radium. So is it a filter sock? Is it within a crucible material? Like, what is the physical composition? That gamma dose is going to be fairly universal. But as soon as you start refining that model and adding more receptor scenarios to it, such as plant uptake, you really need to be specific on that material composition, similar to what we do with radon emanation, similar to what we do with the leach testing. So I just want to put that out there as a caution that this 109 millirem, for example, per year, that is a very, very, very conservative assumption to get to that point. And applying that across all waste streams that have a 10 picocuries per gram lead-210 is, I wouldn't advise doing that. That was all.
Thanks, Colby. Hillary.
Yeah, I just wanted to address Jamie's concerns because they are very important. So currently, the facilities that have portal monitors, we have several for waste facilities and several for metal scrapyard facilities. And we have a pretty good working relationship with most of those facilities now, especially waste management. And one of the things that we do is we actually set up for waste management, they have a license with us now for if they do get radioactive materials. And we do annual training with all of their facilities that have portal monitors. And it's general radiation safety training, how to fill out the special permit forms that we have to create, and how to detect what type of material it is. So generally for just a regular waste facility, we have them set up an isolation area. They can take part of that load and put it over there. They can also reject the load and send it back. So like if it came from a medical facility, they know exactly where their materials come from and they can send it right back to that medical facility. If it's a iodine treatment for a cat or came from a care home, then what they can do is they can isolate that and put it in their isolated area, and they'll monitor it to make sure it's iodine and let it decay away naturally. So we do put that training out there, and we do have licenses with some of the facilities that have portal monitors. So if we were going to require waste facilities and scrap yards to start having portal monitors, that is going to also be kind of part of the bigger question. And would we need to create licenses for them if they do potentially have radioactive materials on site? And so it can get pretty complicated pretty fast, but we do address that part of it, Jamie, because you're like, yeah, there are facilities that don't get this all the time. They have no idea what to do when that portal goes off. So we have been trying to bridge that gap a little bit.
Thanks, Hillary. I appreciate that. So I don't see any other hands raised, but I wanted to make sure we have about half an hour left in the scheduled time. I want to make sure everybody who hasn't had a chance to speak up knows that they have an opportunity and welcome their thoughts or input now. I can call on people specifically, but if you haven't spoken up now and you have something to say or like to say or questions you'd like to ask, or just thoughts about the dialogue that's happened over the last 2.5 hours, please feel comfortable and free to speak up. Damon, Shirley, Mason, I think these are the folks, Commissioner Pat Shannon, that we haven't heard from that I see are on my list of people on the in the participants right now. So if anybody would like to say, has anything to say, Damon, yes, dive in.
Hey everybody, good morning. Damon Mottstory here in a volunteer capacity with Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. I had to drop off for about an hour of the committee meeting this morning, so I apologize for that. And as such, I'm going to keep my verbal comments pretty brief at the moment and sit on this a little bit more and write some comments. But I just want to say that I'm glad that we're exploring the plant-based pathway. I think it's important for us to be really comprehensive in exploring the possible exposure pathways. And I'm also really pleased that the presentation this morning was really focused not just on the 500 millirem proposal for exposure to naturally occurring radioactive materials, but also the sort of the larger landscape of the different exposures that people experience in either occupational settings or otherwise, because I think it's really important that we, because of the linear no threshold model, look at a really comprehensive scenario of different exposure pathways. Yeah, I think that's about it for now. I don't have anything too more granularly specific to say at this point in time, but again, going to be digesting this a little bit more and submitting some feedback soon.
Thank you, Damon. Really appreciate that. At some point shortly after this meeting, we will also post the recording to our website. So if you wanted to go back and pick up the hour you missed, you can certainly do so. Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So other folks who haven't had a chance to speak up, if you'd like to say something, now is a great time. Like I said, Mason, Shirley, if you want to have another follow-up, Morgan Ireland, and Commissioner Pat Shannon from Gillum County. You don't have to, of course, but now is a good time to have something to say.
I'd just like to say that this is Commissioner Shannon. I understand and knew that there was a lot of detail to this project, but it was very educational today to dig into some of those details. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Pat. And part of our intention, of course, is of these presentations is recognizing that the depth of material and technical knowledge of the information, we're trying to make sure that there's at least some educational component. And these first 3 meetings, we've really tried to prioritize making sure that the information that is available is understandable and that there's opportunities for everybody who may not be an expert or a health physicist to be able to at least understand what we're talking about. So I appreciate that and hope it's been serving its purpose and to be informative. Morgan in the chat says nothing for me. Thank you. Okay, that's great. If nobody else, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot here. But if you want to say something, please do so. And if not, written comments can always be submitted. And one more thing before we get into a few other specific questions, just a reminder, as Jeff mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we are formulating a survey that we're going to send out to the RAC members with some specific questions, just to try and get a standardized format and to ask some specific standardized questions to try and collect, just another way to try and collect more feedback and more input from the RAC members. So we'll be pulling that together over the next few days and weeks and getting it out to the RAC as soon as we can. But just know that that's coming at some point after this meeting. Jeff and Tom from my team, any other specific questions you want to pose right now that we haven't really got to? Tom, you had a question here. The question about should the pathway process be a cumulative dose? I think that's been bantered about here in the dialogue, but we haven't really settled on that question. I don't expect that we will settle on it per se, but it's a specific question we can ask is whether the pathway process should have a cumulative dose or whether it should maintain its current process, which is individual assessments for each of the 3 pathway exposure scenarios, radon, water, and gamma. And I think that might be a question we pose in the survey as well. I know it's a technical question, but it's an important one.
The ivy on the pillar that I'll add to what you just said, Max, is that as I understand how radon is regulated federally, it tends to be on its own track, that you don't incorporate the radon dose in addition to the other doses. But that is certainly open to how people want to discuss that. And if we want to have a more specific discussion about that in a future meeting, just let us know.
Jeff, that's a good thing to have brought up. We should have thought about that sooner, but it is probably worth a discussion, maybe not right this second because we haven't necessarily prepared for it, but that's a very good point about radon. And radon is generally regulated based on flux rather than a dose metric. So it would be an interesting discussion to have, I think, and it might inform some of what you guys think going forward, this is just totally me speaking off the cuff, but you mentioned radon and I was like, oh yeah, we should have talked about radon. So.
Thanks, Emily. Appreciate that. Shirley, go ahead.
Yeah, the question, if I understood Tom's point just a minute ago, or his question, the cumulative issue just keeps coming up time and time again for me. And I'm hoping that we can maybe focus some attention on that somehow, maybe in a future meeting, but that just makes a lot of sense to me that it's fine if something's okay when it comes in the door, but what follows it and what preceded it in terms of total impact.
And it's possible for a waste to pass the current pathway exemption process and to have a dose of effective dose of 400 millirem for water and 400 for gamma and a dose from radon. So in sum total, that waste would be above 500, but it passes the pathway because we don't look at those three things combined when we're evaluating it.
Yeah, and in addition to the individual assessment of any individual waste product, there's a question that Andy was bantering about earlier about how, if there's some allowance for landfills to take types of T-norm in a barrel, how do you decide how much is allowable before it becomes an issue? And that's an open question. And I think Shirley, you're picking up on that important question. Jeff, go ahead. You got another question to pose here.
I wanted to pose a hypothetical just for this group to ponder, especially as we talk about the potential for allowing land cover and whether the statute would allow it. But let's take the hypothetical. What if the end result of this rulemaking is that we decide to do a risk-based definition where whatever the landfill can accept until you hit a certain dose can be allowable in that landfill. And let's assume there's some regulation, maybe with DEQ's help, to ensure that worker doses stay within the thresholds. And let's assume that it passes the statutory test. Is this group okay if the end result of all of that is that Oregon allows higher concentrations of T-norm than is allowed in other states, such as North Dakota, Colorado, that have fracking? And kind of related to that, how important is relative attractiveness as a state to this group? Is it a factor that we should be considering or not?
Jim, go ahead. Jim, go ahead, and then Damon.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I mean, I think we're all struggling with getting to either going to have to regulate it or you're going to have to not regulate it. And to be able to regulate it, then you need to know what's going in the landfill, right? I mean, I don't see any way around that. And if the way we regulate it is risk-based, meaning that, you know, there's no danger of substantial, whatever the statute says, I don't have it memorized, but then you got to measure it and you got to monitor it, right? So, and you're absolutely right on the attractiveness piece. If I have a standard, you know, as a company that I'm permitted or being held to, I'm going to look at every waste that comes across my desk to see if it meets the standard. And if it meets the standard, then we're going to accept it in most cases. So, you know, will that draw fracking waste? My sense is probably not. But as you said, with DEQ's help, you know, maybe there's a acceptable middle ground, I guess.
Thanks, Jim. Damon, go ahead, and then Shirley.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a really important question to ask, and I appreciate that you asked it. Thank you. I think one thing we know is for sure the case is that with the expansion of the fracking industry in the United States and the premium at which finding a location for waste disposal from these kinds of procedures, the demand is very high, and therefore I think we need to be really careful about taking any actions that would make Oregon sort of disproportionately more attractive as a destination for this type of waste than comparable states. I think it's that opens us up to suddenly be dealing with a lot more of this than may be wise for public health. And so I think this is something we need to be considering really carefully.
Thank you, Damon. Shirley.
I'll just ditto what Damon just said.
All right, very good. Jamie Jones, DEQ.
Hi, I need to do some research and confirm a couple things, and I'll do that shortly, hopefully today. But generally speaking, we have a rule in place that says that if something isn't allowed to be disposed of in another state, we can't accept it from that state for disposal. Generally, to this point, it's been like hazardous waste for like something that's considered a hazardous waste in California can't be disposed in Oregon as like a non-hazardous waste to avoid those sorts of regulations in California. That's like kind of that concept, and it goes for all other like states. I think that concept, but I have to double check, could also apply to this. So part of the argument, like making it more attractive, if it's not allowed to be disposed of in, wherever, that rule says that it wouldn't be allowed to be disposed of here. But I'll get that 100% confirmed for the next meeting so that isn't like a point of discussion if it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Feedback on that would be appreciated. It's important for us that we're consistently applying and creating rules and standards that apply for both Oregon-based companies as well as any other company around the country, right? And so, keeping in mind the point of regulation here is the radioactivity of the material, and so that's something that I think that's what the statute directs us to do, and so there's a consideration, and I recognize the DEQ may have a different rule, and we're going to the statute. I'm aware of that statute existing, or maybe it's a rule, Jamie, but how it's applied, I'm not sure. So I just want to keep us in mind that there's a consistency amongst the radioactivity is the assessment based on the radioactivity of the waste is the key threshold for us. Anyway, I'll stop there. Jim, go ahead. You got a hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say the statute that Jamie is talking about is almost impossible to figure out whether or not a facility could take a waste. I think it's probably more, it may be more appropriate to just, if you're going to want to restrict waste from Oregon being attractive to other things, maybe we just name the waste that you don't want to accept, right? Fracking waste, maybe a named waste in Oregon that we put in the statute. Ultimately, waste is waste. Some waste is more inflammatory, I guess, than other wastes. But I guess in my view, if waste A is got the same level of radioactivity as waste B, they're both the same. They're both acceptable if they're acceptable. So I know there's a lot of want and need to worry about certain waste streams. So I guess if you're going to bring that into play, you're going to need to name them. Is probably my best example of that.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate those thoughts there. Anything else on this topic from other members of the group? And I think we're, the question is worth at least a little bit of discussion on in-state versus out-of-state a little bit, but to be clear, from our statutes right now, there's no distinction between where a waste is generated, whether it's generated in the state or out of state. There's no distinction on that. And I would offer that we, in recent months, have looked at, as Jeff mentioned on his slide about the pathway exemptions, have analyzed and approved pathway exemptions for waste generated from in-state and waste generated from out of state. Because it's about the radioactivity characteristics as compared to our rules, not about the origin of the waste or the provenance of the waste or whether it's from a particular industry or not. It's about the radioactive characteristics of that waste. Okay. Anybody else, something else good for the cause here? We have 15 minutes left. I don't see any hands raised. But if there's any other topics to dive into now or comments from anybody, now's a good time. Jeff or Tom or Chris Clark, anything from our end that you want to pose to the group? Questions you want to raise or comments to make now? All right, hearing none.
Max, I'll just reiterate that when we get down to, as Colby mentioned, when you make the real model, not just the discussion purposes model, there is a fair amount of technical backing that needs to be in that, as well as having all the right tools. And what we're trying to do here is establish some of the basic boundaries of what that's going to look like. But once we get down to that level, as I said before, I would love some help and just other perspectives. And so I will be seeking out whether people would like to participate in a technical subcommittee, if you will, to talk through some of those. Once we have the bones of the policy level guidelines there in place to then to turn that crank and do the math. So be on the lookout.
Yeah, that's
Thanks.
great. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. All right. Well, we have some follow-ups that we'll be sending out, as Jeff mentioned there. And of course, as we gave the preview about our specific survey questions we're going to pose to the group. We will also be in touch with scheduling the next RAC meeting. As Jeff mentioned, I think we're going to put that RAC meeting off until we have time to send out the survey and collect some feedback on that. So it might be, well, we'll try and get the survey out for setting up the next meeting sooner rather than later, but the actual meeting itself might occur some point a little bit later. Tom, Cecilia, reminding me we're supposed to offer a time for public comment. Chris Clark, I think we need to do that. And I don't see in the queue on the line here anybody who is not on the RAC, but I will make an offer right now. If there is anybody from the public who's not on the RAC who wants to have something to say, this is a public meeting, of course, and so now would be a time for a person who's not on the RAC to have something to say. But I don't see anybody in the attendee list that isn't on the RAC, so this might be a very brief time. And we will also get the materials, this recording, posted to our website in a couple days' time, and then we'll let everybody know that they can find it if they want to listen to the conversation again or watch the PowerPoint presentation. The slides that Jeff gave earlier are already posted to our website, as well as a couple of written comments we've received. And if we receive any more comments in writing, which we're certainly welcome, by the way, please do so. You can email them to me directly or to Chris Clark, just respond to his messages and provide written comments. We will also post those to our website. And when we do get comments in, we'll let everybody know. So it's not just going to be posted to our website and you won't know it's there unless you actively check. We'll send everybody a message out to let people know that material has been posted when it is done so. Anything else from the RAC or from the Odo team right now? If not, I want to thank everybody again for a great conversation. Chris Clark, you look like you're coming off mute to have something to say.
Oh yeah, Max. No, I was just gonna yeah. Once again, thanks everybody for their time, and then just put in a plug that if you do have any substantive comments, please send them to all of us. But if you just have any comments about the process itself or how these meetings could be work better, or if you have any ideas for future meetings, you can also just ping those to me, so we can keep working on improving how we're facilitating these meetings.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Absolutely. Okay. Well, at that, we will wrap up here a few minutes before noon. Again, we'll be in touch, and thank you all very much for the conversation, for the time. Really appreciate it.
Excellent conversation, guys. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
So long.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Okay. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.